And who better to interrogate that idea than a man who understood both the literal and the metaphorical prison?
Friend, the most dangerous form of captivity is when you do not know. Something that too many people today do not understand. Freedom is not the absence of discomfort. Freedom is the presence of justice.
Free within these boundaries. It was an illusion of freedom designed to prevent people from asking why the boundaries existed in the first place. And when I look at the modern world, I see echoes of that logic everywhere.
But in the language of their lived experience, we ask them simple questions. Why do you need a pass to walk in your own country? Why does your child attend a school with no books?
They understood that if you can control the framework within which people think, you do not need to control their bodies as tightly.
Why do you work in the gold mines that make other men rich, while you return home with dust in your lungs and nothing in your pocket?
Black South Africans would only be educated enough to serve, never enough to lead. These structures did not disappear.
People saying things like, it does not matter who you vote for, nothing changes.
Political freedom without economic justice.
It seems to be this freedom is not a state you achieve, it is a relationship you maintain.
Hope is the most radical form of resistance there is. Do not surrender it for comfort.
Welcome to the show. I want you to imagine something with me for a moment. Imagine spending 27 years behind bars. 27 years. You walk into prison as a young man, full of fire and conviction, and you walk out with gray hair, with decades stolen from you, decades you will never get back. Your children grew up without you, your marriage collapsed under the weight of distance and politics and surveillance. The world outside changed so dramatically that when you finally stepped through those gates on February 11th, 1990, blinking in the South African sunlight, the Cold War was ending, the Berlin Wall had already fallen, and the country that locked you away was being forced to reckon with its own soul. Now imagine that after all of that suffering, after all of that loss, you choose not revenge, but reconciliation. You choose not bitterness, but bridge building. That is not a story from mythology. That is the life of Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela, born in 1918 in the village of Mvezo in the Eastern Cape of South Africa, a man who went from prisoner number 46664 on Robben Island to the first Black president of a democratic South Africa. And today, he is sitting with us, not to relitigate the past, though we will go there, but to ask a question that I think haunts our present. A question that most of us are too comfortable to ask ourselves honestly. Are we truly free today, or are we just comfortable? Because here is what keeps me up at night. We live in an era where we can say almost anything, go almost anywhere, access almost anything, and yet something feels hollow. Something feels managed. Something feels like the bars are still there. They have just been redesigned to look like convenience. And who better to interrogate that idea than a man who understood both the literal and the metaphorical prison? Madiba, it is a profound honor to have you here. Welcome to the conversation. If this conversation just made history actually fun for you, then you already know what to do. Like this video right now, it tells the algorithm that people want more of this, and trust me, we've got some legends lined up that you do not want to miss. Comment below and tell me, who do you want me to sit down with next? Cleopatra, Napoleon, Nikola Tesla? Your comment might just decide the next episode. Share this with someone who thinks history is boring, because we are about to change their mind completely. And if you are not subscribed yet, hit that button and ring the notification bell right now, because this channel is just getting started and the guests only get bigger from here. The past has never sounded this good. See you in the next interview.
Thank you for that introduction, though I must say, you have described my life with a dramatic flair that I myself never quite mastered. But you are right about one thing, and I want to begin there, because it matters. The question you raise about freedom, this is not an abstract question for me. It was never abstract. You see, when I was a young boy growing up in the Transkei, in the rolling hills of the Eastern Cape, I believed I was free. I could run through the fields, I could herd cattle, I could sit at the feet of the elders and listen to stories about our people. About the great chiefs, about a time before the white man came and drew his lines across our land. I felt free, but I was not free. I simply did not yet understand the nature of the cage. And that, my friend, the most dangerous form of captivity is when you do not know you are captive. When I went to Johannesburg as a young man, when I saw the pass laws in action, when I watched black men and women humiliated daily simply for existing in a space that the apartheid government had decided was not theirs, that is when freedom stopped being a feeling and became a question. a political question, a moral question, and eventually, a question I was willing to die for. I said those words at the Rivonia trial in 1964. I said I was prepared to die for a free and a democratic society. People remember that line. But what they forget is that I also said I hoped I would not have to. I did not romanticize suffering. I did not seek martyrdom. But I understood. Something that too many people today do not understand. Freedom is not the absence of discomfort. Freedom is the presence of justice. And if you have comfort without justice, you do not have freedom. You have anesthesia. You have been numbed to your own condition. That is what I fear when I look at the world today.
That phrase you just used, anesthesia, that stops me cold. Because I think that is exactly what so many people are experiencing right now without having the language for it. We are numbed. We are scrolling through our phones. We are consuming entertainment endlessly. We are told we have more choices than any generation in human history, and that is technically true. But the choices feel shallow. They feel managed. And I want to push on something you said, because it is historically fascinating. You described growing up feeling free in the Transkei before you understood the system around you, and I think there is a parallel to today that most people miss entirely. In the 1950s and 60s in South Africa, the apartheid government under leaders like Hendrik Verwoerd did not just rely on brute force. They built an entire architecture of normality. They created Bantustans, these so-called independent homelands, where Black South Africans were told, look, you have your own territory, you have your own governance, you are free within these boundaries. It was an illusion of freedom designed to prevent people from asking why the boundaries existed in the first place. And when I look at the modern world, I see echoes of that logic everywhere. Not racial apartheid, I want to be clear about that, but structural containment dressed up as choice. You can choose between 40 brands of cereal, but can you choose to live in a society that does not require? Madiba, should young people have to go into debt for an education or medical care? You can post anything on social media, but the algorithm decides who sees it. So my question for you, Madiba, is this. When you were organizing with the African National Congress in the 1950s, when you were part of the Defiance Campaign of 1952, how did you go about waking people up to the cage when... So the cage was designed to feel normal? How do you fight something that does not look like oppression to the people living inside it?
That is perhaps the most important question anyone can ask about liberation, and I will tell you, it was the hardest part of our struggle. Harder than the armed resistance, harder than the years on Robben Island. Because the apartheid system, as you rightly say, was not simply about violence. It was about legitimacy. It was about making the unnatural seem natural. Verwoerd, and before him Malan and Strydom, they understood something They understood that if you can control the framework within which people think, you do not need to control their bodies as tightly. The Bantustan system was a masterpiece of political deception. They told our people, you are not oppressed, you are separate. You have your own leaders, your own traditions, your own land. And some of our people believed it. Some of the traditional chiefs cooperated with the system because it gave them a measure of local authority, even as the real power, the economic power, the mineral wealth, the industrial capacity remained firmly in white hands. So how did we wake people up? We started with education, but not the kind you find in classrooms. We started with what I would call consciousness. We went into the townships, we went into the factories, we talked to people about their daily humiliations, not in grand political language, but in the language of their lived experience. We asked them simple questions. Why do you need a pass to walk in your own country? Why does your child attend a school with no books while the white child down the road?
Why do you work in the gold mines that make other men rich, while you return home with dust in your lungs and nothing in your pocket? The Defiance Campaign of 1952 was not just about breaking unjust.
It was about breaking the psychological acceptance of those laws. When 8,500 volunteers went to jail for deliberately violating apartheid regulations, they were not just protesting. They were demonstrating that compliance is a choice, and that choosing to stop complying changes everything.
8,500 volunteers deliberately choosing imprisonment. That is a staggering number, and I think most people outside of South African history have never heard that figure. And what strikes me about it is the inversion of logic. In most societies, the punishment, it is the threat that keeps people in line.
On April 27th, 1994, the ballot papers were counted, the world celebrated, and then on April 28th...
And I want to stay on this idea of psychological liberation because I think it is the thread that connects your era to ours in ways people do not expect. There is a concept in modern psychology called learned helplessness, coined by Martin Seligman in 1967. The basic idea is that when people are subjected to conditions they cannot control for long enough, they stop trying to change those conditions even when the barriers are removed. The cage door opens, but they stay inside. And I see this everywhere in modern democracies. voter turnout declining, political engagement shrinking to performative gestures on social media, people saying things like, it does not matter who you vote for, nothing changes. And I have to wonder, Madiba, because you lived through both sides of this. You lived through the period when people were awakening, organizing, risking everything. And then you lived through the period after liberation, after 1994, when the euphoria of democracy began to fade and people started to realize that political freedom does not automatically translate into economic freedom or social transformation. Did you see that disillusionment coming? When you became president in 1994, when you stood at the Union buildings in Pretoria and took that oath, did you already know that the harder fight was ahead? That the fight against apathy might be even more difficult than the fight against apartheid?
I will be honest with you, and I think honesty is the only currency worth spending when you are discussing these matters. Yes, I knew. Not in the way a prophet knows, but in the way a man who has studied history knows. I had read extensively during my years on Robben Island. We had a library, not a grand one, but we had books, and we studied. I read about the French Revolution and how the promise of liberté, égalité, fraternité gave way to the terror. I read about the decolonization of other African nations, Ghana under Nkrumah, Algeria after the War of Independence, and I saw how liberation movements that had won the political battle often lost the economic and moral battles that followed. So yes, I was under no illusion that raising the new flag and holding an election would solve everything. I knew that apartheid had not merely been a set of laws. It had been an economic system. The Migrant Labor System, the Group Areas Act, the Bantu Education Act of 1953, which was specifically designed by Verwoerd to ensure that Black South Africans would only be educated enough to serve, never enough to lead. These structures did not disappear. On April 27, 1994, the ballot papers were counted, the world celebrated, and then on April 28th, the same mines were owned by the same companies, the same land was held by the same families, the same schools in Soweto still lacked the resources of schools in Sandton.
And I will tell you something that people do not like to hear. The negotiated settlement that ended apartheid, the settlement that I am credited with, that I am praised for, it came with compromises. Deep compromises. We agreed to certain economic frameworks. We agreed to protect existing property rights. We did this because the alternative was civil war, and I had seen enough blood. But those compromises meant that freedom arrived in a form that was incomplete. Political freedom without economic justice. And that gap, that space between the promise and the reality, that is where disillusionment grows.
Extraordinary, grinding, unglamorous patience. That is such a necessary corrective to the way we think about change today.
Indeed.
We live in an era of instant results, same-day delivery, instant streaming, immediate gratification, and we have imported that expectation into our politics and our social movements. If a protest does not produce change within a news cycle, people move on. If a campaign does not go viral, it is considered a failure. But the anti-apartheid struggle lasted decades. The ANC was founded in 1912. You were inaugurated as president in 1994. That is 82 years.
Yes, a long.
Multiple generations dedicated their entire lives to a cause whose fulfillment they might never see. And that kind of long-term commitment, that willingness to plant trees whose shade you will never sit in, that is almost incomprehensible to a culture built on quarterly earnings reports and trending topics. But I think there is a deeper point embedded in everything you have shared today, Madiba, and I want to name it because I think it is the answer to the question we started with. Are we truly free or just comfortable? And the answer, based on everything you have said, seems to be this: freedom is not a state you achieve, it is a relationship you maintain with yourself, with your community, with your principles. It requires constant attention, constant effort, constant willingness to be uncomfortable. And comfort, when it becomes the highest value, when it replaces justice as the organizing principle of a society. Comfort becomes the enemy of freedom. Not because comfort is inherently bad, but because comfort makes. You stop asking questions. It makes you stop looking at the systems around you. It makes you stop caring about the people those systems are hurting, as long as you are not one of them. And that, I think, is the deepest form of captivity. The captivity of indifference, the prison of not caring. Because at least a person who is chained knows they are not free. They are not free. A person who is comfortable might never know. Mr. Mandela, your thoughts?
You have spoken well, and I want to close my part of this conversation by returning to something personal. Because the personal is where freedom begins and where it is most tested. When I was released from prison in 1990, the world wanted a saint. They wanted a man who had transcended all bitterness, all anger, all human frailty. And I allowed that image to exist because it served the cause. A saint could negotiate peace. A saint could reassure the white minority that they would not be slaughtered.
A saint could hold a fracturing nation together through sheer moral authority.
But I was not a saint. I was a man. I came home to a marriage that had been destroyed by distance.
And by the impossible pressures placed on Winnie while I was away, my children had grown up without me.
And some of them carried wounds that I could not heal with hugs and speeches.
I made political compromises that left millions of my people still poor, still landless, still waiting.
And I lived with the knowledge that the freedom I had won was partial, imperfect, and fragile. But here is what I want to leave with you and with everyone watching. Imperfect freedom is still worth fighting for. Partial justice is still worth pursuing. A world that is slightly more fair than it was yesterday is still a world worth building. Do not let the perfect become the enemy of the possible. Do not let the enormity of what remains undone paralyze you from doing what you can today. I have seen the worst of what human beings can do to one another. I have been in the cell. I have buried comrades. I have held the hands of mothers who lost their children to police bullets. And still, I believe in the possibility of a just world. Not because the evidence guarantees it, but because the act of believing creates the conditions for its emergence. That is what I learned in 27 years. Hope is not naivety. Hope is the most radical form of resistance there is. Do not surrender it for comfort. Do not trade it for convenience. Do not let anyone convince you that the world cannot be better than it is. It can be, but only if you insist upon it. Every single day.
I have to be honest with you. I have done a lot of episodes of this show. I have sat with remarkable minds and talked about history and philosophy and politics, but I do not think anything has hit me quite the way this conversation has. And I want to take a moment to tell you why, because I think it matters for everyone watching. We started this episode with a question. Are we truly free today, or just comfortable? And what Nelson Mandela gave us over the last 50 minutes was not a simple answer. It was something better. He gave us a framework for thinking about the question honestly. He showed us that freedom is not a binary. It is not something you either have or you do not. It is a practice, a daily discipline, a relationship between the inner life of the individual and the outer. And he warned us about the structures of the society they live in. And he warned us from the depths of personal experience that none of us can fully comprehend, that comfort is the most sophisticated cage ever designed, because it does not look like a cage. It looks like progress. It looks like convenience. It looks like 40 streaming services and same-day delivery and the illusion of infinite choice. But if those comforts are built on systems that exploit others, if they are sustained by indifference, if they require us to look away from the suffering that makes our ease possible, then they are not freedom. They are anesthesia. And I keep coming back to that word he used in the very first minutes of our conversation, anesthesia. We have been numbed. And the first step toward freedom, the most important step, is to feel again, to let the discomfort in, to ask the hard questions about who benefits. From the way things are, who pays the cost? To organize, to commit, to show the extraordinary, grinding, unglamorous patience that real change demands. If this conversation moved you, if it made you think, if it made you uncomfortable in a productive way, then I want to ask you to do two things. First, subscribe to this channel and hit the like button, because every time you do that, it helps us reach more people with these conversations. And second, do not. Let this be content you consumed and forgot. Let it be a catalyst. Let it change how you move through the world, even in some small way, starting today. Thank you, Madiba. Thank you for everything. And thank you for watching. We will see you next time.